Welcome to the Healers Café, conversations on health and healing with Dr. Manon.
So, welcome to the Healers Café, and today I have Titus Chui. Did I say that correctly?
You got it.
Okay. And I'm really excited because he'll be talking about the root cause of concussion care and how to get to understand what that is, whether you have symptoms, all of that. We're going to explore all this. But let me just tell you a little bit about him. He's the #1 best-selling author, award-winning international speaker, and functional neurologist that specializes in post-concussion syndrome. And he teaches people how to heal their brains and reclaim their lives after concussion through personalized brain training programs, online masterclasses, and immersive wellness retreats. And well, let's start with that. So how did you get into all of this yourself, and what made you interested in this and follow this field?
Yeah, so it's been quite a journey. And again, thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to meet you and chat with you. And so over 20 years ago, I was in a terrible car accident and I was actually on a scooter on my way to work. This was way before I knew anything about neurology or holistic medicine or any of that. I was living overseas teaching English. On my way to work, got hit by a car and I flew like 10 feet off my scooter, broke 3 ribs, dislocated my shoulder, and suffered a concussion. And so from there, I tried a lot of different things, especially at that time. The most kind of pressing symptoms for me was the chronic pain from the shoulder and the neck. And I tried things within conventional medicine and nothing worked. And so I had to go searching outside the box. And I'm so glad and grateful that I did, because I was able to turn some of the darkest times in my life into this, like, yeah, it was almost like I think about it in terms of like metaphorically, like big
Mhm.
pictures, like the
Right.
universe kind of slapping me and be like, hey, you need to change directions, right? I didn't see that at the time, but that's when I look back on it, it's like, oh my goodness, yeah. Because I think at the time I wasn't living into my higher self, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
there's a lot of things that I was struggling with. But anyway, so after that, I went outside the box. I went back to school. I got a degree in chiropractic because that was one of the things that really helped with the chronic pain. My brother, he adjusted me and bam, it was like the lights turned back on
Mm.
in terms of pain. Like it just dramatically decreased and it gave me hope, right?
Mhm.
And it
Yeah.
also just totally like blew my mind into this whole world of natural medicine that I didn't even really know about. And so I
Mm.
went back to school, became a chiropractor, and along the way I just fell in love with the brain and neurology. And it was interesting because at the time, as a chiropractor, I'm like, I was just so interested in learning about neuroanatomy and physiology, but I was like, how am I ever going to use this practically for my patients?
Mhm. Mhm.
But sure enough, I went to this one seminar as a functional neurology seminar, and all of a sudden, it all came together. How not only was chiropractic, like it was not only complementary to understanding neurology, went hand in hand, right? Because chiropractic, first and foremost, the way it works is by changing neurological pathways, right? On one
Mhm.
specific level, like changing the cerebellum. There's research that looks at how it activates the prefrontal cortex, right? So along the way, I discovered neurology and I just really loved it. And first and foremost, it was like this way of me understanding frameworks, like
Right.
what makes me tick as a human being, what makes us tick collectively, but also very much as a clinician, thinking through really difficult cases.
Mhm.
Because up to that point, as you probably know, like there's a lot of different like protocols and out there. Some of them are very effective, especially the ones that allow more fluidity, right? And critical thinking. And I found neurology to really give me that, like that strong,
Mhm.
foundation. And so from there, I work with all kinds of patients who like with conditions and that didn't fit these other protocols, but then I would just go back to my understanding of neurology and be able to kind of build my own along the way, you know. And obviously when I first started, you know, I wasn't very good at the building process, but as you know, as you go through time and you develop the skills, not only is it a science, but it then becomes an art. So yeah,
Mhm.
that's kind of how I fell into
That's
all
true.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because so many times it's a personal experience that you don't find solutions for. But I want,
Right.
because I think a lot of people who have concussions don't realize
Mm,
that they're suffering from it. And I
yeah,
think your own story, when the biggest pain is the shoulder, right? So it's
exactly.
like
I'm just like, I
that's
need
what
to
you're
get rid
after,
of this
right?
pain.
Yeah. So how did can you kind of bring us through a little bit what was the steps in which you realized it's
Mm,
actually a concussion, and how
yeah.
do people recognize that they're suffering from a concussion?
Yeah, so that's a great question because just like I had mentioned, like you brought up, initially I was like, wow, this pain was terrible. I wasn't able to do all the things I love. So I was looking for an answer for that. And thank God I found it. And as I went through school, like chiropractic school, and then I got a master's in nutrition and I did a postdoc in neurology, I would learn all these tools, right? And then I'd bring them back to my patients and their health would improve, right? And then after I got those adjustments, a lot of my health improved. And then I learned about diet and supplements. And so I'd experiment on my own health. And a lot of health issues that I had prior to that car accident growing up, like brain fog or just
Mhm.
not, I wasn't very motivated and I had bad skin, was getting sick all the time.
Mhm.
When I started to experiment with those foundational like lifestyle dietary supplement things, those things just disappeared, right? And so it
Mhm.
was like this deeper discovery process. And so about, let's see, I would say maybe 5 years after I graduated though, right?
Mhm.
Even though thing like those health problems that were nagging for my entire life, those started to disappear like when I
Mhm.
made some foundational changes
Mhm.
over the course of that time. I would think probably around the time that I graduated, but then gradually over the course of about 5 years, I started to develop these darker psychological symptoms that I
Mhm.
never had before. I started to develop um, like anger issues. Like, sure, before I'd get irritable, but it'd be more like uncontrollable. I started to develop, in some situations, it got really bad, like paranoia and
Mhm.
just a lot of these more mental health issues that I never had, right, growing up. And so it's really interesting to me. Like I said to you before, you know, working with patients, I'd go to all these seminars and learn
Yeah.
about the brain and advanced practices. And I bring it back to my patients. I started to experiment on my own brain with those. And those symptoms started to improve. And all of a sudden, it was like this light bulb went off. And I'm like, or turned on rather. It's just like, oh my goodness, I think a lot of that stuff developed from that massive car accident I had like
Right.
5, 10 years prior, right? And then
Right.
along the way, when I kind of had that realization, I was just like, wait a second. I actually had several minor head injuries prior to that, like growing up. I could remember
Mhm.
at least
Mhm.
two. And then even after that car accident, there were a few situations, right? And
Mhm.
then it all like it was so, I mean, I don't even know what the word is, just kind of ironic that I'm this guy, this functional neurologist, helping so many patients with their concussions. And I didn't even realize that
That you have
I
one.
probably, of like these newer symptoms that I didn't really have issues with, at least in part, I think a
Yeah.
big part was from that, especially that massive car accident, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's the thing. It's, in my book, I talk about it. It's a silent epidemic. I think a lot of people go through life, you know, with these unexplained symptoms. And
Right.
they might not even be neurological or psychological. I've worked with a lot of patients who develop autoimmunity after a concussion, right? That's the
Yeah.
whole brain gut connection leading to expression of autoimmunity, as an
Mhm.
example. I've worked with a lot of patients who develop chronic digestive issues after having a car accident. And prior to my understanding and a deep dive into the world of concussion care, I was just like, oh, that's interesting, right? But now I understand the mechanisms underneath that, the science, so
Mm-hmm.
that we can develop really specific protocols. But yeah, so that
Mm-hmm.
was my journey, right?
Mm.
It was like this
Interesting.
awakening,
Yeah.
interestingly enough, right? And then I realized that, oh my goodness, I think a lot of people out there, right, who with these chronic health challenges, part of like after that happened, like every time I do an intake, it's like, do you have a history of concussion? And then a
Mm.
lot of people are like, no, I never. I'm like, do you have a history of concussion? Like, were you in a car accident? Oh, yeah. When I was 15 years old, I was in this really bad car accident, but it was just whiplash, right? And
Mm.
then I fell off my bike once and landed on my arm, but that's when all my symptoms happened,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, as you know, being a clinician, it's like that concussion is just one of those stressors, right? When we take
Right.
histories, we explore. It's like, but I think it's a really under-recognized one because you don't
Mm-hmm.
even need head trauma like I experienced
Right.
to have a concussion. You can,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, you can have whiplash. And
Mm-hmm.
because our brains exist in this kind of goldfish bowl, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It sloshes around. I've had patients like I described, like they fall off their bike and they catch themselves, right, on their arm.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, after that, they developed autoimmunity or these neurological symptoms. And they're like, what's the connection? Again, it's that physical trauma to the brain.
Yeah. 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 No, and it's interesting too, because from a patient perspective, you don't know that something's not right, but you go
Yeah,
after the pain first,
exactly.
and then you find potentially a solution for the pain, ideally without drugs with more side effects,
Yeah.
and but you're not necessarily told,
Hmm.
do you have a concussion maybe, or and putting this together is so important,
Yeah.
especially when we're looking for solutions. So
Exactly. Yeah, like root cause, like getting to the root cause. And
yeah,
for so many chronic health challenges, sometimes there's more than one root cause, right? These
yeah,
triggers that we're talking about, the stressors on the
right.
nervous system. But I find again that concussions, even really mild ones, maybe built up over time, right?
Mhm.
Those are just kind of like check marks to the added stress on the nervous system.
So you have a book, and I'm just making sure the title I have it right. Is it Brain
Save.
Save?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So are there in your book, what is it you're helping people be able to do? Because save means you can save a brain before it's ruined.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, so what is the focus there, and how does it help people?
Yeah, great question. So, like I said before we got on this call, like prior to shifting my energy speaking directly to people with concussions, I used to teach other practitioners about neurology.
Mhm.
But I realized it's just like I want to give this directly, share this information, and teach a person who's struggling with some type of health challenge. And in this case of the book, post-concussion syndrome, I want to give them the tools to at least get back up on their feet, right?
Yeah.
So the book specifically is written for that person out there. I wish I had this book, honestly, yeah, like a
Oh,
year
sure.
after my car accident over 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, imagine that like you had a concussion as an example, and I'm like your best friend. But I'm also somebody that totally understands, who's also had a concussion, but
Right.
understands the ins and outs as a professional, right?
Mhm.
And so that's kind of how the book reads. It's like
Mhm.
really conversation. The whole goal, right, is several fold, but one of the major ones is giving people hope, right? Because a lot of people think that after a concussion or brain damage, there's nothing you can do,
Right.
based on this really old thinking that the brain doesn't change. Obviously,
Right.
there's a lot more information out there, but I still see a lot of doctors, even though they might have read about neuroplasticity in medical
Yeah.
school,
They haven't
how do
incorporated.
you apply neuroplasticity to your patient, right? And
Yeah.
so, number one, first and foremost, is giving people hope that number one, they're even regardless if you've had a concussion, there's things you can do to
Mhm.
heal, right?
Mhm.
Healing is always
Right.
possible, right? And that I'm, you know, a
Yeah.
personal testament to that through my whole journey. Number two, what I find with a lot of people, especially if they're already aware that they have a concussion, like a lot of people I work with, a lot of patients, they, you know, they've been to other doctors, you know, and the doctors run their tests and they're like, oh, there's nothing wrong with you, right? It's all in your head.
Mhm.
So not only does that person have to deal with the physical and mental, emotional stress of their health challenge, then on top of that, they're dismissed by their
Yeah.
practitioner,
Mhm.
not because there actually isn't anything going on, but it's because of their own like lack of understanding around what actually happens with a concussion. So
Mhm.
one of the major goals of me writing that book too is to be like, hey, what you are dealing with is real, right?
Mhm.
It actually, you are not crazy, and it actually is all in your head, right? But it's a very
Literally.
physical reason why you have these symptoms. And
Yeah.
sometimes I remember, you know, as I was in the process of writing the book, one of the reasons why I wanted to build that into the narrative,
Mhm.
working with patients, I just remember these times where I'll do an assessment, an exam, and I'll be like, here's why, you know, and I break it down. They
Mhm.
just start crying,
Yeah.
right? Because the first time in 5, 10, 15 years, someone like validates their experience and not
Exactly.
just
Yeah.
writes them off, right?
Yeah.
So that's another reason why I wrote the book, is just to tell people like what you're experiencing is real.
Mhm.
And more importantly, there's, or not more, but just as important, there's actually things you can do about it. So at the end of the book in part 3, there's a 6-week plan that walks people
Mm.
through some of the foundational steps that they can take, at least to get themselves off the
Yeah.
ground. And the great thing is, you know, depending on where they're at in their healing journey, I've heard from some people, I love it. You know, I hear from people all over the world, like on, you know, social media or on like, you know, messaging me. They're like, after I tried that one thing, my energy levels, right? I just
Yeah.
love that, right? So
Okay.
some people, it's just like one little thing,
Exactly.
you know,
Yeah.
and it's this foundational approach. Well, where for other people, it's just like who have a more severe situation, at least it helps them get off the, you know,
Yeah.
like energy, right? Then to be able to seek out further treatments or more advanced things as needed. So
Yeah.
those are the 3 main reasons. And I would have to say one last thing about that is also just to bring awareness, because kind of like
Right.
what you alluded to and what we're speaking to here, I think it's a silent epidemic. I think a lot of
Mhm.
people have
Mhm.
had concussions. That might not be the number one root cause
Mhm.
for their symptoms,
Right.
but I've worked with so many patients over the years that have changed their diet. They've
Mhm.
taken supplements.
Right.
They're maybe practicing yoga and meditation, yet they're still struggling. And I
Mm.
usually find that the missing ingredient, number one missing ingredient I see, at least with the patients I work with, is this whole picture of brain training, how to start to apply neuroplasticity
Mhm.
to rewire their brains and get their lives back, right? And so
Yeah.
it's a completely different approach because the brain's unique in
Right.
that not only does it require nutrients and requires rest
Mhm.
and movement and all that, but
Mhm.
it also requires activation through very specific neurological pathways.
Mm. Well, I'd be very curious if I was just going to share a little bit about, in my own practice, and
Mhm.
the reason I got so interested in concussions is because either people were diagnosed with it, and it's exactly the tale you tell. It's like, well, there's nothing, they don't have hope,
Mhm.
but they have something else. So they've come in with concussion and some problem, you know.
Exactly.
And in the work I do, which is called Bowen therapy, and then I've sort of added plenty to it,
Yeah,
and work with trauma and emotional trauma as well, because I find that a lot of things add up together. And so
absolutely.
it's really wonderful to sort of undo all of that and get to the root cause. But what I have found is that symptoms of concussion disappear with this work, and then it's retrospectively they go back, but without the scans or without other ways, they everything's changed, but they don't know, they know, but they can't tell their doctor, oh, I've changed. Like everything's different now. I feel
Exactly.
so much better. They have the energy, they have that. And a lot of this is work that I do with the actual TMJ joint.
Oh, huge. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I was just wondering like how, and sometimes the coccyx, which you think, oh, well, that's on the opposite side. So
Yeah.
what is your how do you explain the work you do? How does it work? Or yeah, what can people learn on that level?
Yeah, so that's awesome. Yeah, I love the fact that you mentioned the TMJ because, even from a biomechanical perspective, if someone's had trauma to this area, it can create symptomatology, right? And so, what's really fascinating though, from a neurological standpoint, and you're probably aware, it's like the TMJ is one of the most important joints in the body because of the somatotopic representation in the brain. And for those of you out there who have no idea what I just said, meaning the amount of brain cells dedicated to the perception of your jaw as well as the control of your jaw is massive, right? And so I find a lot of people, part of my process too is like, you know identifying, number one, what's the root cause for this person. And for some people it could be like a TMJ that's off. I find another access point that's really powerful for people with concussion, especially if they have motion sickness, vertigo, or dizziness, is the inner ear, right? So doing different types of inner ear movements or eye exercises and different types of what we call vestibular rehab, like combining that with TMJ work, that's massive. And when you talk about the coccyx, yeah, absolutely. It's like just, trained as a chiropractor, like I was saying earlier, one of the ways in which chiropractic works, when we do an adjustment to the spine or to a joint, it powerfully activates this nerve impulse and action potential into the cerebellum, right? But we can be really intentional based on what we find in the analysis. And so whenever I think about, and that's just one aspect of concussion care. But the bigger framework that I've developed over the years, what I call root cause neurology, is the three pillars of brain health. That's one of the core foundations of my work and what I did to heal from my concussion and how I've helped, many patients. And the three pillars is like the physical brain, right? Which we talked about kind of earlier, the communication pathways like your cerebellum. And so different things like somatic based therapies like TMJ work, chiropractic adjustments, vestibular rehab, that all works on sculpting the neural pathways, right? And just like we were talking about, that's one of the number one missing ingredients I see in any care plan, because medicine is so biased towards biochemistry, right?
Yeah.
Now it's important. And what I mean by biochemistry, like diet and supplements, right? Medications even, so, but that's what I call the chemical brain. So the second pillar is like, if we're thinking about the physical brain as like the roots of the tree, the soil is the chemistry, right? So the chemistry that our actual physical brains exists in very much determines like the function of our physical brain, like the communication, how fast it is or how slow it is, if it's muffled. So I find that in addition to, looking at the physical like structures, and we can do that through neurological exam findings, and then we can fix that through different types of somatic based therapies using the senses, whether, somatic based work, or we can also use light therapy, sound, smell, taste. And we can also use the vestibular sense as well as proprioceptive, right? So things like balance exercise. My point is, all that works through the physical structures to create neuroplasticity, right? Now, I've worked with a lot of patients too, though, and myself included, that had that work, that were blessed to have found someone like you, or someone that, like me, or like a vestibular therapist or a chiropractor. Maybe the chiropractor didn't even know about the concussion, but they're just like, well, when I adjust this, things improve, right? But I've had patients where the opposite, they actually were able to connect with therapists that worked on the physical structures, but they're still struggling. And then I do an inventory on their health, and it'd be like, whoa, you've had this digestive issue for years prior to your concussion. And it wasn't until we identified that, and there's different ways of doing it. You can do it through physical exam findings, you can do it through self-assessment quizzes, And there's advanced lab tests out there now that explore your microbiome and
Right.
explored if you have leaky gut or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So all those things, my point is, they're windows into the chemistry. And so
Yeah.
sometimes it just has to be personalized. That was actually the case for me.
Mhm.
I did a lot of the brain training myself. I did like higher tech, electroceutical devices, low level laser therapy to
Yeah.
target the neural networks, meaning to strengthen the physical brain, right? And I got better, but then I hit a plateau. There was still
Mhm.
this thing, like, I don't know how to describe it, right? It's more like this, um, Viktor Frankl, he has that saying between stimulus and response, they have that space. My space was very small, right?
Yeah.
Stimulus response. And even after all the brain training I did,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I identified a gut infection through some lab testing on
Mhm.
myself,
Mhm.
put myself on a gut healing protocol. Bam, that's what took
Yeah.
my health then to the next level.
But
It
that's,
was
I
like,
mean,
yeah,
it like many people don't realize that our neurotransmitters are actually also in our gut, right? Like our gut
exactly.
actually does this, you know. So my background is as a naturopathic medical doctor, right?
Oh,
So
cool. Yeah. So you
yeah,
totally get
we
that,
do
right?
that too. And it's like if that's missing,
Yeah.
like it's interesting. There's so many ways
Mhm.
to actually help people, right?
Exactly.
And if it's, that's why I say, if it's not working one way, knock on another door or another.
Exactly. Yeah.
Don't give up, because hi, it's Dr. Manon, and I just want to take a moment, commercial break, to ask you to subscribe to my podcast and kindly leave a comment if you're enjoying this. And also, just to let you know, I have tips for people in health looking for solutions to just a variety of issues. It's more like an attitude of health, and they're entertaining short videos, and you can find those under drmanonbolliger.com/tip. The link is here, and I look forward to hearing from you. Because if so many people have a piece of the pie, but
Not
they
the
don't see
big picture.
the
Yeah,
whole
exactly.
picture. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So it's like for me, I did a lot of the physical stuff, and then
Mhm.
the next step for me was the gut stuff. And after I did that, that space started to grow, right?
Right.
Between stimulus and response. I was just
Yeah.
more present in my life, less irritable, and
Mhm.
that healing continued to happen. So
Mhm.
that's the second pillar, right? The chemistry.
Yeah.
And then the third pillar that I look at when it comes to brain health and concussion recovery is the emotional brain, right?
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is like the thoughts that we think, the beliefs that we hold about ourselves, about our healing, about the world, right?
Yeah.
As well as our stress management practices. Do we have downtime? Like all those different things that nurture our emotional self.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
all three things, all three pillars need to be intact. I found for a person to really truly experience that deeper healing, right?
Mhm.
Physical, chemical, emotional. And you make a great point. It's like if something isn't working for you, like
Mhm.
for those of you watching out there, knock on another door, right? Because that's the thing.
Yeah.
The key is personalization. You have to find what works for you, right? And so I can be telling you guys right now, if for those of you watching, you're struggling with a concussion, you're like, oh, I'm gonna do a gut healing protocol, and you do it, and you're like, Dr. Chu, that didn't do anything for me, probably
Mhm.
because your gut wasn't involved, right?
Mhm.
And so the cool thing is, outside of just working with a practitioner that has a window into what the most powerful access points are,
Mhm.
your body also has clues. Like, so as an example,
Exactly.
right, if you're struggling with a concussion and you have constant gas and bloating, you might want to look into a gut healing protocol, right? And
Mhm.
there's also physical signs as well, like the skin on the back of your arms. If you have bumps on it, it's a sign that you might have a gut issue or a food sensitivity. So
Mhm.
those are all clues that us as trained practitioners we look at, but you can also start looking into those things yourself as clues as to, maybe I should explore gut stuff, right? Or
Mhm.
it's like, oh no, I've already done all that, but I still, when I stand up and I get a little lightheaded, or when I move quickly and my heart races more so than it should, that might mean that you need to explore the physical structures, like your brainstem as an
Mhm.
example. So those are just little like tidbits for those of you
Yeah.
who aren't practitioners, right? There's ways where you can kind of piece it together yourself, but obviously, right, I've worked with a lot of patients who've tried putting it all together themselves, maybe because they were discouraged by a practitioner who just didn't get it and dismissed them, or maybe they just don't have access. You know, at some point it is when you can connect with someone who's been through that whole process can be accelerated like tenfold. Like
Absolutely.
that's one of the reasons why I wrote my book, and I actually just released a brand new masterclass, like a 6-module masterclass, because I wish I had the resources, right, when I was going through it back in the day. Because number one, I would have even realized that, oh my goodness, some of my health issues are from a concussion. I didn't even know that, right?
Yeah.
But then number two, actually having practical resources and actions that I could take on my own, right? So that's one of my missions, you know, in addition to, like I said, my, you know, going through the process and working with many patients over the years. I love that process.
Mhm.
And as I went through school, I also and continued, I developed this, discovered this deep passion for teaching too. And so it's like, wow, how can I combine the two? I'm going to write a book, right? I'm going to teach the person who's struggling with the concussion, teach them how to fix their own brains, right? At least the first few steps, you know, to get themselves
Yeah.
from like a crisis situation to start feeling better, so then they have the resource to continue the exploration as needed.
Actually, I'm curious on this point because I totally agree with everything you're saying, and bringing people hope, and hope, it's not phony hope. It's not like,
Mhm.
I think somebody said to me, hope is dope, it doesn't do anything, and it's like, no, it's not true.
Yeah,
It's like, because we live in a world in which our medical system is not healing based. It's really disease management.
exactly. Yeah.
And so it is a paradigm shift when
Mhm.
the customer, the patient decides, okay, I actually want to get, not just mask all this discomfort and pain and make
Yeah.
new stories about how inept I am now, or how upset I am, or whatever the story is. When they really want to get through this, when
Yeah.
their healing journey is also their life journey,
Exactly.
as
Yeah.
it is.
There's that shift. Exactly.
Exactly. And then you open up to so many things. One of the things, though, that I found fundamental in my work, and I'm just curious for you, is the work with the parasympathetic system,
Mhm.
or vagus nerve, but the idea of shifting people that are in the sympathetic overdrive. And I found with concussions, whether it's whiplash, the cause, or any sort of acrobatic guarding where the brain still gets knocked,
Mhm.
uh, they still experienced a deep stress, a
Oh yeah.
fear
Mhm.
of what could have happened, especially with car accidents.
Mhm.
And I feel like until we address that fear, that emotion, but not just the emotion, the physiological impact
Yeah.
of that, it's much harder to heal. So
Oh yeah.
yeah, how are you seeing that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we can talk about like the parasympathetic versus sympathetic, right? Those are a really important part of this conversation, because when you're in the stuck in the fight or flight mode, you're all about survival, but not about healing, right? So the parasympathetic's all about that healing response. But in addition, like what I found in my research too, actually before we get there, like one of the core areas is the brainstem. When we talk about like within the nervous system, there's multiple control points of the autonomic nervous system. A lot of people talk about the brainstem as being one of them, and the vagus nerve that's really popular these days. So that's one point, right? And specifically, the top part of the brainstem, let me show this here, is what we call the mesencephalon or the medulla. So this is the brainstem for those of you watching. Like here's the outer covering, and here's the, like when I flip it around, this like the deeper structures inside. And then the brainstem is situated in between your brain and your spinal cord. So I'm pulling that out. And one of the core like nodal points of that sympathetic parasympathetic balance is your brainstem. The top part, your midbrain or mesencephalon, is kind of like it puts the accelerator on your fight or flight response. Whereas the bottom part, the medulla, it puts the brakes. So these two kind of work hand in hand to modulate that stress response versus that resting, digesting, and healing, right? And so that's where the vagus nerve comes in. And by the way, the vagus nerve is actually, it has a dirty little secret, and it's actually just a communicator. It's a connector. More importantly, is actually your brainstem, the medulla, and the organs that the vagus nerve connects with. So I know a lot of people, everyone's like so hot about the vagus nerve, but as a functional neurologist, like I'm kind of geeking out here, nerding out a little bit. More importantly is the brainstem structure, because that's what controls the vagus, right? And then from there, like I was saying before, this is one big checkpoint in the whole autonomic balance, right? Between like being focused and alert and in the fight or flight versus resting, digesting, and healing. But that's just one structure. There's other structures involved, the cerebellum, as an example. We talked about that earlier through chiropractic and other somatic body work. The cerebellum communicates powerfully to the brainstem, right? And so that's another access point that we can use to help modulate, right? The whole stress response after trauma, right? But then from there, we can go even further. Like I'm going to go back and put the brainstem in its rightful place. Who controls the show, like the kind of the boss of it all, is the prefrontal cortex. So many of you out there watching, you've probably heard of, whether you're a practitioner or not, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the circuitry of the stress response. Guess who sits above the hypothalamus? The prefrontal cortex. So that's where things like meditation and biofeedback, neurofeedback come into play. The thing is, though, right? And what I've seen in my practice, and you can probably attest this too in your experience, when it comes to things like fear after trauma, as an example, you know, it's like we can try to talk ourselves out of it. Like, let's say I was in a car accident. Here's a good example. Years ago, when I was in that car accident, like prior to that, I was in a massive earthquake, like never been one before. But I actually developed PTSD afterwards, after the earthquake, because I'm from Chicago, the Midwest of the United States. Right. Yeah, we get rain and snow. Those are our natural quick catastrophes. This massive earthquake, I was so traumatized after that, but I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
But one thing that clued me into that, I remember afterwards, but I didn't put the two and two together. I never was afraid of flying. And then I developed this fear of flying. What? And I was just like, what? Where did that come from? But then all of a sudden it hit me, because I was on this elevator one day and the elevator was going up, right? And when it stopped, it went like this, right? It jiggled. I had the same fear response. It wasn't flying. It wasn't an elevator, but what the two had in common was this motion, right? So my nervous system, because the earthquake was that strong, it was going up and down. It was imprinted in me that this motion is dangerous. I'm going to be afraid. My point in describing all this, regardless of, if I've been in car accidents, all this trauma, that was honestly more traumatic for me, at least in terms of the fear, than the actual car accident. Like I got on a scooter probably like 3 months later, but part of that is probably because damage to the prefrontal cortex. I didn't have very good discernment, right? But that being said, we're all works in progress. So, but my point is, like, I could sit on that elevator, even though I realized, had that insight into that. I could be on the airplane and be like, there's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing. I can try to engage my prefrontal cortex and say, nothing to be afraid of. The statistics of blah, 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 and blah, right? Doesn't matter, because who's running the show at that point? It's the brainstem, right? It's the limbic system. It's what we call the reptilian brain. In particularly, I find that a lot of people after trauma, and it could be both emotional or physical, their midbrain in particular gets stuck in overdrive. How do I know? Because one of the things the midbrain processes is lights and sounds, and
Mhm.
also the startle response. So
Mhm.
I see this time and time again after, especially like physical trauma, people just get really jumpy, like a noise, they're like, whoa, right? Or they
Yeah.
become really sensitive to light and sounds. That tells me that their midbrain is stuck in overdrive. And
Right.
so that's so, I'm glad you brought that up, because, you know, a lot of people then think like, oh, so if I'm afraid of driving now because of this, I just have to face my fears. Sometimes that'll
Yeah.
help,
Yeah.
right? Or I just have to think happy thoughts, or I just have to
Right.
visualize my beautiful reality. Now, those are things I do now in my life.
Yeah.
But when I was in the midst of it, the rock bottom, I tried those things and
Yeah.
didn't work. I felt terrible about that, right? I'm like, everyone else is thinking positive is working for them. But then what I realized, oh, is because it was these subcortical structures, meaning underneath
Right.
the brainstem, the amygdala, the cerebellum, to name a few. That's where, when I focus the energy on for myself and for my patients, that's when the breakthroughs would start happening.
Mhm.
Because in the battle between your brainstem and your prefrontal cortex, which is relatively new, it's a newer structure,
Right.
this one's all about survival. Who do you think is going to win, right? And thank God, because if your brainstem didn't work, it's responsible for vital life-giving functions like
Mhm.
breathing, right? So, but that's the thing, in trauma, those things that help us to survive on a base level, they will,
Mhm.
but at what cost, right? So I agree with you. I think facing those fears, but what I found in my practice, the whole like three pillars approach, physical, chemical,
Mhm.
emotional, if people are struggling with fear or some anxiety after trauma, I don't find that like this top down approach of
It doesn't.
talk
I
therapy.
agree. I agree.
It's like lifting, you got it's like
Yeah.
it'll help kind of move things along, but
Yeah.
it's like this uphill battle.
Yeah.
Whereas if we start with the body, if we
Yeah.
start with the senses,
I
right?
so, oh, it's so exciting. No, it's true, because that is for me. I mean, it's true. It's my reality as well.
Right?
And
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
and people say, oh, no, no, just, think better, or whatever. Like, no,
Mhm.
it's really physiological. And it's
Exactly.
like turning a switch off
Mhm.
and telling the body it's safe,
Yep.
and then it starts to rewire, and then you can talk about all the other stuff,
Exactly, yeah.
yeah.
Because the language of the brainstem is not about compassion and patience and gratitude and
No,
positivity. It is survival at all
exactly.
costs, right? So you
Exactly.
have to speak to it on that level. But the great news is, and you alluded to this earlier, one way of doing that is by activation of the vagus nerve, more specifically the medulla,
Yeah.
which is just as old a structure as the top part. And so
Mhm.
you don't have to, then it becomes, like you said, a switch rather than like this painful, like just cognitively, mentally, emotionally draining, you
Right.
know, affirmations or positivity, which, don't get me wrong, like I practice all those things now, because now it's like my
Sure.
prefrontal cortex is not no longer strangled by my brainstem, and it allows me to tap into those higher, higher
Yeah.
functions or higher expressions of humanity, right? But
Mhm.
if we're stuck in this survival mode, it's so hard to
Yeah.
break through that until, like you said, you
Yeah.
start flipping that switch.
Exactly. One more case I just come to mind, but this is now in modern medicine, and this is the conventional approach, um, to a person who had a concussion, a young woman,
Mhm.
and she came to see me, and she was put on antipsychotics,
Yeah.
and that's because her brain wasn't right.
Yeah.
And
It's
so they looked
circuitry,
at
right?
it like,
Exactly.
that's the problem, right?
Mhm.
And I know when I treated her, it only took 3 sessions, literally, to
Yeah.
switch this. And then, because I didn't prescribe those drugs,
Yeah.
and I always refer respectfully back to the person who did.
Exactly.
So I said, go check whether there could be a way of weaning you,
Exactly.
because all of the symptoms she had went away. And that was exactly that switch.
Exactly.
And that's it. And that's all that she needed. And she had put off her, like she was going to get married. She had all these plans.
Yeah.
And
It's got to
things,
put your life on hold, right?
absolutely. And she wasn't even sure if she could offer her life with her partner. And just said, maybe I just set you free, like the consequences of the lack of knowledge.
Exactly.
Anyway.
That's one, again, like I said, one of my missions is to get that information out there to people that need it, directly to the people that need it,
Exactly.
Yeah,
so
I love, that story you shared, because, alluding back to what I said earlier, I think a lot of us, unless we really are in it, either as a practitioner working with patients, or as like myself, not only a practitioner, but actually gone through that process personally, it's, we're taught that there's the brain you're given, like even your personality, there's, we can definitely have conversation about that, but it's like, this is what you have. And if there's damage, there's nothing you can do, right? And that can be further from the truth, But the interesting thing is, not only is it possible to heal through the miracle of neuroplasticity, right? It's not my opinion, it's just scientific fact. Not only is it possible, but it can happen rapidly, just like what you're describing, right? I had this one patient who, after her concussion, for 2 years, she developed insomnia. Like she didn't have one solid night's rest throughout, over 2 years. And, through my assessment, I determined that a big part of it was this midbrain, because she had a lot of like the jumpy symptoms, like the startle response and sensitivity to light and sound. All we did was different things to activate her vagus nerve and to activate that lower part of her brainstem. Within 3 days, I think it was 3 or 5 days, she had her first solid night of sleep, right? And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's like once you find that switch, not only is it possible to heal, but it can happen much more rapidly.
Yeah.
That doesn't say like she was done, right? There was still like biochemical things and stress hormones and other things we needed to work on, right? And more foundational lifestyle stuff. But it was just kind of like that, right? That sigh of relief, right?
It's almost like the journey begins.
Yeah, exactly. And you can feel that as a practitioner there. You just know through your intuition and your experiences. But also the great thing is, through the neurological approach that I use, there are physical signs of that. Once, because when we talk about sympathetic, parasympathetic, right, pupil dilation is a sign of heightened fight or flight response, or like excess sweat, depending on the type of sweat, heart rate, pulse. There's actually objective findings that are clues. And again, when I tell my patients that, they're just like, right? Because that's the thing, like you talk about, and you alluded to this earlier, how some people, it's just like they run the test and there's just like nothing wrong. The great thing is there are clues, right?
Yeah.
That are windows into these physical structures that you can see, right?
Yeah,
Size of the pupil, right? Sometimes I work with patients who have what we call dysautonomia, an imbalance or dysregulation of their autonomic nervous system. They might sweat more on one side versus another. Guess what? That's a clue. And once we start normalizing that, then we know we're moving in the right direction. So it's awesome because there's concrete things, but I'm sure just like you, right, as we do this over time, we develop that intuition too, right, where we just know. But the fact that there are these physical signs, it's always, I love teaching my patients about that. Then they can start checking in on themselves, like, oh, right, I feel like I'm moving in the right direction,
So our time is up. It just flew by, but so
it's been a great conversation.
Yeah, no, and when I post this, if you have like a link to your book or where people could purchase it, or your course if you're training practitioners, please share with me, and then I will list that and let you know when we're live.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us at the Healers Café with Dr. Manon. For more information, go to drmanonbolliger.com.